Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Welcome to this three-part video series entitled Top 10 Microstakes Leaks. We're going to be thinking about the top 10 ways that players at the microstakes end up losing money. These are going to be grouped in no particular order. The severity of each of these leaks really depends on the extent to which each of them appears in your own game. You may find that you are affected by some of these leaks a lot more than others. Hopefully throughout this video you'll be able to identify which leaks affect you and what you can do to solve the problem. Without much further ado, let's get on to microstakes leak number 10, calling too much. As a general rule, the average player at the microstakes does not bluff very often. If that player is being aggressive, it usually means that they are going to have a strong hand. There are exceptions to this rule. There are certain types of players who very much enjoy firing multiple barrels as bluffs or running a crazy bluff in some other situation. In general, the average player at the microstakes is not going to be making big bets without a strong made hand. The leak here in this case is players with a tendency to call more often than they should. Perhaps they think their opponent is bluffing and they want to call, or perhaps they just want to see what their opponent has. And these players are of course not bluffing anywhere near as often as they would need to be, and they end up having a stronger hand at showdown. And this causes many players at the microstakes to lose a lot of money in situations where they should probably be folding. There are certain situations that represent strength, and it's these situations that, if you find yourself in these situations at the microstakes, the overwhelming likelihood is that your opponent is not going to be bluffing and that they are going to have a strong made hand. One of these situations is your opponent fires 3 barrels, and by this we mean perhaps they open raise pre-flop and then they proceed to make a big bet on the flop and the turn and then the river. While it's true this could be a bluff, at the microstakes 90% of the time or more it's not going to be a bluff. It's going to be a strong made hand that wants to extract value from the hand you hold. Another situation is your opponent makes a raise on the flop, turn or river, or also a check raise. These can be grouped in order of strength. Usually a raise on the flop is the weakest of all these. A raise on the turn is going to be a lot stronger. A raise on the river is typically very strong. It's not likely to be a bluff at the microstakes. And stronger than just raises are check raises. In order to check raise, your opponent is going to need to be out of position, and he checks to you and then makes a raise after you bet in position. Typically check raises are going to be stronger than raises, and the later the street, the stronger the line that is taken looks. In general, at the microstakes, players don't raise on the flop, turn or river without a strong made hand. They don't generally do it as a bluff. Of course, it can happen some of the time. There are certain types of players out there who know maybe about check raising the flop as a bluff, but even these players, it's very unlikely they're going to check raise the turn or raise the turn as a bluff, and the same applies to the river. If you are facing an unknown opponent and they decide to raise you on one of these streets after you bet, there's a good chance your opponent is very strong, he's not bluffing, and you should seriously think about folding all but the strongest of hands. Another situation is 3-betting, perhaps less so than some of the other lines. There are an increasing number of players who know about 3-betting light, 3-betting as a bluff. This particular line is very player dependent. The reason is there are some players out there who have very low 3-bet percentages. They may be only 3-betting 2% of the time or so. And against these particular types of players, you don't want to be calling very often, because when they 3-bet, it usually means they have a hand like Queen's Plus or Ace King and pretty much nothing else. There are of course other types of players, as said, who are 3-betting quite light, and the rules don't apply in this particular case. But you should be aware that against certain types of players, you definitely shouldn't be calling very often against pre-flop 3-bets. The final line or lines include 4-betting and 5-betting. Light 4-bets, they don't happen very often at the microstakes at all. They do happen occasionally, but in general you are probably better off assuming if someone is 4-betting you, they're doing it with a strong value hand. And again, the same goes for 5-bet bluffing. It just happens extremely rarely at the microstakes, almost never. If someone is 5-betting over your 4-bet, there's a very good chance that they have a strong made hand. And the problem really arises if you find yourself routinely stacking off with hands like ace-queen suited pre-flop or maybe pocket queens. You may in fact find yourself in a situation where you are leaking money. At the microstakes, it's not always the case that even hands as strong as ace-king or pocket queens are necessarily a standard stack-off hand pre-flop. There are some situations where you should be folding ace-king pre-flop, and there are some situations where you should be folding pocket queens. We're going to look at a few examples of situations where perhaps players at the microstakes are calling too much. The first is a pre-flop situation, and perhaps I can elaborate somewhat on situations where you should think about folding the stronger part of your range, for example queens and ace-king. In this particular hand we have pocket jacks, and we make a standard open raise from under the gun. The player in the small blind decides to 3-bet. Typically, if someone is 3-betting against your under the gun opening range, it is a lot stronger than if they were 3-betting against your button open or your cutoff open. In this particular case, there is a very good chance that we are behind the 3-betting range of the small blind here. His range probably looks something like pocket queens plus and ace king, and pocket jacks is going to be an underdog against this range. We are referring specifically to microstakes here. There may be higher stakes games in which pocket jacks here is still in reasonable shape against the 3-betting range of the small blind here. Perhaps the small blind is bluffing. In microstakes games, it's very unlikely this player is bluffing here, and his value range has pocket jacks in bad shape. If in this particular situation you are routinely stacking off, or even continuing in the hand with pocket jacks, or perhaps even pocket queens or ace king, you may find that you are leaking money here in the long run. Another thing to notice is the small blind stack size is less than 100 big blinds, so it's not as if we can call here and hope to set mine, because we don't have enough implied odds given that he is slightly shallow. In this particular case, it may seem like a weak play, but we have to fold our pocket jacks here. And this is a very common spot where players are leaking money at the micros. They see a hand like pocket jacks and they think there's no way I'm folding this hand, can't fold jacks pre-flop. When given the positions involved, small blind is representing a very strong range, and it's a range that is ahead of pocket jacks. This next hand, we have ace of diamonds, 10 of diamonds. We are on the button, and the player in the cutoff makes an open raise, and we decide to flat, which is fine. The flop comes 10-7-2, a nice flop for us. We flop top pair. We're also somewhat aware of the fact that the flop is quite dry. We don't necessarily expect the cutoff to have connected that hard with the board. You still can have some made hands, however. He can have things like overpairs, he can have something like 8-9 suited, he can have sets, and then he can have his range that has missed the flop, things like king jack, king queen, ace x type hands, etc. He decides to fight a c-bet, and it's possible he is c-betting with most of his range here, including all of the hands that have missed the flop. We definitely don't want to be folding here. We have top pair, top kicker. This is definitely a legitimate call. The turn is a 7, which is not a very good card to bluff, for reasons which I won't discuss now. Already at the microstakes, you should be somewhat concerned about your opponent firing 2 barrels on this board. because even firing 2 barrels at the microstakes is somewhat unlikely without a made hand. There's a good chance our opponent has something like 7-8, which he wanted to fire a c-bet with. He could also have a hand like pocket 2s. He can also have things like pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket aces. It's not the case he can never be bluffing here, even at the microstakes. There are some combinations of hands that microstakes players will fire a second barrel with, which aren't necessarily strong made hands. To give some example, if our opponent holds something like the ace king of hearts, or the ace queen of hearts, or the ace jack of hearts, he may well be firing a second barrel here. If he holds something like the 8-9 for the open-ender, he may well be barreling here. It's also the case that he might be value betting again with something like king 10, queen 10, or jack 10. While we are therefore somewhat suspicious of the turn bet, it's going to be fine in this particular case to make the call, assuming that there are enough hands in our opponent's range that aren't strong made hands. In terms purely of his value range, we're not necessarily in great shape. The only thing we beat are worse 10s, and the rest of his purely value range has us in bad shape. So it's fine to make the call here. We shouldn't necessarily expect this to be hugely profitable in the long run, however, just because of the nature of microstakes games. Players don't fire barrels with bluffs anywhere near as often as they do with strong made value hands. The river comes a jack, and our opponent fires a sizable third barrel, and this is really the type of situation where players at the microstakes are typically calling far too much. If our opponent was very aggressive, there are of course hands that haven't got there, things like naked overcards or overcards with hearts. The likelihood is, however, our opponent is not going to be making this bet as a pure bluff. Some of his draws did get there. If he had the 8-9, he's got there. Even a hand as strong as ace jack of hearts in this particular case, there's a possibility our opponent is not going to feel comfortable firing a big third barrel, just due to the nature of microstakes games. If he has a hand like king 10, queen 10, he's almost definitely not going to be firing a big third barrel here, because players at the microstakes don't go for thin value anywhere near as often as they should either. Therefore, most of his range in this spot basically has ace 10 in very bad shape. Our opponent usually either has something like pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket aces, or he has a 7x, he has pocket 2s, maybe sometimes he has pocket 10s. It's very unlikely he's going to have something like ace king of hearts and run 3 barrels as a bluff here. Players at the microstakes just don't think in this way. So it's definitely a good spot for us to think about folding here, despite having second pair with a good kicker. This next hand we have king jack of hearts. We open raise from the cutoff. We get called by the small blind, and the flop comes jack 7-5. Good flop for us, top pair, reasonable kicker. Our opponent checks, and we definitely want to go for value on this board. There are plenty of hands our opponent can call with, any type of gut shot or straight draw, perhaps hands like queen jack he's calling with, any type of flush draw. We definitely want to bet here for value. And our opponent decides to make a check raise. We mentioned this in the slides. Players at the microstakes don't check raise bluff very often at all. In fact, your average microstakes opponent is never check raise bluffing. They are only check raising 2 pair or better. Even if our opponent has a hand like ace jack, here the standard play for most microstakes players is to flat ace jack here, because it's not the nuts. The same goes for any type of draw. If our opponent has a hand like 8-9 or 6-8 or 2 clubs, it's very unlikely a microstakes player is going to put in a check raise here. They are going to flat and hope to make their draw. Therefore, our opponent's check raising range here, if we assume he's an unknown, it's most likely going to be something that looks like maybe some types of 2 pair combos if he's calling with these pre-flop. It will of course depend on his VPIP and PFR, but potentially he can have things like 7-5, jack 7, jack 5 if they're suited maybe. He can also have hands like pocket 7s, pocket 5s, Some of the time, things like slow played queens plus, or maybe pocket jacks, which he preferred to flat with pre-flop. In this particular case, if we assign him this purely value range, our top pair reasonable kicker is actually in really bad shape against his range. And unless we have a read on this player that he is check raising light, we should probably think about laying down our top pair, top kicker in this particular case. One final example, which we will come back to in the next microstake leak. We have ace queen suited from the cutoff, which is a very standard open raise. Notice also in this particular hand we have deep stacks. We are sitting with 200 big blinds, which does affect the dynamic of the hand somewhat. The flop comes queen 10-8, which is a good flop for us in that we have top pair, top kicker. It's also a very drawy board. There are a lot of potential draws our opponent can have. Plenty of gut shots, things like straight draws if he has a jack king, things like heart draws. There are also a decent amount of two pair combos he could have spiked, things like queen 10, 10-8, 9 jack for the straight. So we have a strong hand that we definitely want to go immediately for value with. We want to protect against any draws. We're also somewhat aware of the fact that our opponent may have outflopped us here with two pair or a straight, or he may be very strong with a hand like king jack of hearts, for example. Until our opponent lets us know otherwise, we should definitely be going for maximum value and protecting against all these draws, and we make a sizable continuation bet on the flop, and our opponent calls. The turn is the 3 of clubs, which is more or less a blank. He does put a second flush draw out there. It's possible our opponent could have something like king jack of clubs, so this may have improved his hand in that he may have picked up a flush draw. Not necessarily though. For the most part, we expect this 3 on the turn to be a pretty inconsequential card, and as a result we definitely want to fight again for value. Again, the river is pretty inconsequential. There's a very small chance our opponent has improved to a flush if he does have something like ace jack of clubs or king jack of clubs or any jack of clubs with a second suited card, for example. In general though, it's going to be extremely unlikely our opponent has a flush here. On the other hand, he could have hands like queen jack, queen king, ace 10, types of pair hands that he will pay off a third bet here on the river. There's a good chance our opponent would have check raised a hand like jack 9 or a hand like queen 10 or 10-8 on the flop, because he also perhaps is aware that the flop is very coordinated, and if he has a strong made hand like two pair, there's a good chance he's going to want to check raise the flop and protect his hand against the draws. As a result, this is a good spot to go for value. There's a decent chance our opponent just has a one pair hand, like a worse top pair. We don't want to bet hugely big here because we don't want our opponent to fold a hand like Queen X, and we bet around 375. Actually, I don't mind a smaller bet in this particular spot because we definitely don't want to scare our opponent off. It's definitely a good spot to go for value, however. In this particular case, our opponent decides to check raise the river, and basically, while we said it's extremely unlikely that he has a flush, we basically just have to acknowledge that he probably does have a flush in this instance. There's not really any other hand he's going to be check raising the river with. Perhaps once in a while he's taken some weird slow play line with jack 9 or pocket queens or pocket 10s, but the overwhelming majority of the time he's going to have a flush here. And even if he doesn't have a flush, he's going to have part of his value range that has us in really bad shape. Not to mention the stacks are deeper here, so he is basically committing more of his standard 100 big blind stack. He's put already 130 big blinds in the middle. People are much less likely to make these crazy bluffs in deep stacks. Also, I don't want to put this amount of chips to risk. All things taken into consideration, it's definitely a spot where we should be folding, and we'll be coming back to this hand in the next section just to discuss the river play in this particular case. Moving on to our Next, Microstakes leak number 9, missing value. In general, players at the microstakes are calling way too often. In fact, we've just discussed this. This is our leak number 10. Players at the microstakes, they don't fold their medium strength hands, even though there's a very good chance that they're beat. They like calling too much, and they don't like folding. Given that we know that players at the microstakes are calling far too often, our strategy should be to value bet very often, and in some cases to go for very thin value. But in terms of bluffing, it's not necessarily a good idea to bluff very often at the microstakes, because one of these players who loves to call too much is going to end up snapping off your bluff with middle pair or bottom pair, something terrible that they shouldn't call with. As a result, it's better if you don't bluff in the first place, especially against certain types of players, but instead you wait for value hands. Sometimes they don't even need to be extremely strong value hands, especially if your opponent is going to be calling very wide. Let's look at some pointers in terms of going for value. One mistake a lot of players make is they flop a big hand and their instant first reaction is to slow play that hand, and there are a couple of ways they do this. One, they do it by checking when they could be betting. Another thing I've noticed players at the microstakes do is they like to min bet. Perhaps they min bet on the flop, then they min bet on the turn, and then they make a big bet on the river, hoping that their opponent has improved sufficiently to call their value bet. The problem with this type of play is that you are missing a lot of value. You shouldn't ever slow play without a very good reason. Some of these reasons include perhaps you expect your opponent to have a very weak range and you need them to catch up slightly. And the second reason is that you flop the ultimate nuts, something like quads or a straight flush, and you know that there's absolutely no chance that you are going to be outdrawn. But most of the time, even if you do flop something like quads or a straight flush, your default play should be to fast play the hand, try and get the money in as fast as possible, and not slow play. One mistake players make is they try and slow play hands that are very vulnerable. Perhaps they flop top pair, top kicker, but they flop the hand on a board that is very drawy. There are plenty of straight draws and flush draws out there, and they try and slow play in such a situation. Not only do they risk losing the pot by playing passively and letting their opponent complete their draws, but they also miss a lot of value because their opponent is not going to be folding their strong draws, and by slow playing it basically just ends up with a lot of missed value. There are slightly less obvious spots to go for value. These usually include spots on the turn and river where it may not necessarily be extremely clear that there is value to be had, but there almost definitely will be in certain cases. This is obviously not as bad as always slow playing your strong made hands and attempting to min bet on various streets. Of course, your bets should be in accordance with pot size, so you should typically be betting 2/3 of the pot as a very rough guide, and depending on the exact board texture, sometimes you might want to bet pot size. If the board's very dry, sometimes you might want to bet half pot or even less. But your bets should be based on the size of the pot. You shouldn't bet the same amount of big blinds on every street because the pot is growing. So if you continue to bet the same size on every street while the pot is growing, you're giving your opponent increasingly better odds on every street because your bet size is the same while the pot size is growing. So missing thin value on the turn and river is not as bad as completely not getting any value for your hand by slow playing, but it's definitely a way you can boost your win rate. Part of the principle behind this is to continue value betting even when scare cards hit. Now, this is sometimes true, it's sometimes not true. It really depends on how your opponent's range coincides with that scare card. Sometimes you may be able to narrow your opponent's range quite a lot and you expect them to have perhaps a flush draw a huge proportion of the time, and when that flush gets in, it doesn't necessarily make sense to value bet because the chances are that you are beat. Other times, scare cards will hit which they are perceived to be scare cards. Perhaps they are an overcard to your hand, or they complete a potential draw, but they don't necessarily hit your opponent's range, and these types of cards you should definitely continue barreling on. For two reasons. One, you run the risk of missing value if you decide to check just because a dodgy looking card comes on the turn or river. And the second is you may give your opponent an opportunity to steal the pot from you. Just a couple of things to mention. The last opportunity to get values from draws is on the turn, and it's this principle that's the reason why you should often still fast play hands like quads. If your opponent has a really strong draw on the turn, he's going to be calling a value bet, but as soon as he misses that draw, he's not going to be putting any money in on the river. So if you slow play your hand to the river, hoping your opponent improves, yes, sometimes he may make a strong hand and you may get paid off, but a lot of the time you're going to miss potential value on the flop and the turn, your opponent's going to miss his draw, and then you're going to get zero value for your strong made hand. Also, one final thing to mention, a lot of players are increasingly concerned with their non-showdown line. By value betting thin, it's one way you can potentially increase your non-showdown winnings. How does this work? If you think about a spot where you reach the river and rather than value betting you decide to check back, all of those winnings go immediately to your showdown winnings. If instead you decide to bet, some of the time your opponent is going to call, and again it's going to go to your showdown winnings, but some of the time your opponent is going to fold, and even though you are value betting, those winnings are going to go to your non-showdown line rather than your showdown line. So value betting more often and more thinly is one way you can increase your non-showdown winnings. Now, to go back to this hand with the ace queen, we saw how this hand played out before. We flopped top pair on a drawy board, we value bet the flop, we value bet the turn, and we come to this river situation, and we could think, well, potentially our opponent could have had a flush here, but as we discussed, it's very unlikely our opponent has a flush, and while we could consider this river a scare card to us, and some players may think, okay, the board's quite scary here, I check. There's definitely some value to be had on this river. As discussed, we could maybe think about betting a little bit smaller, because our opponent is possibly not very strong here either. As discussed, probably the strongest hand he's likely to have, assuming he hasn't backed into a flush or he hasn't slow played something, the strongest hand he's likely to have is something like Queen King or Queen Jack, and he's also probably aware of the fact that the board hasn't run out that favourably for him. We could have a flush ourselves maybe, we could have a strong hand because we haven't stopped betting, so we can have things like pocket aces, pocket kings, ace queen, queen 10, 10-8, sets, etc. So we definitely want to induce a call here. I think probably a better sizing here on the river might even be something like $2 or $2.25 maybe. The point is that we should definitely go for value here on the river. Despite the river being potentially a scare card, it doesn't necessarily hit our opponent's range very hard. Of course, we know he might have a flush, and in this particular case, just because our opponent does then check raise and we presume that he probably has a flush here, that doesn't mean we made the wrong decision. Yes, if you are value betting thinly on the river, you are going to run into situations where you get check raise a little more often. But despite this, we expect our thin value bet in this spot to be profitable in the long run. Look at another example which illustrates a similar point. In this case, we are on the cutoff with pocket queens and we make an open raise. The player in the small blind calls, big blind folds. The flop comes 7-4-3, reasonably safe flop for us. We definitely want to bet with our overpair here. Try and extract some value. Maybe if our opponent does have a top pair type hand, or perhaps he has something like ace 5 or ace 6 for a gut shot, or maybe he has ace-10 of spades, etc. There's definitely hands we can get value from here, and we want to fire a continuation bet on the flop. Our opponent calls. The turn is a 9 of hearts. Again, we're not overly worried about this card. Our opponent might have something like 9-7 suited, but in general this is a pretty safe card. Our opponent can also have things like pocket 8s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, which he's definitely going to continue calling with, even on this card. He may have picked up a flush draw also. If he has something like ace-5 of hearts or ace-6 of hearts, you definitely fire again on the turn for value. The turn comes the king of hearts, and our opponent checks to us. And yes, this is not really a great card for us. There's a possibility our opponent has something like a heart draw. As in the previous example, it's not necessarily that likely. One of the downsides with this card, even if our opponent doesn't have a king, which he might do sometimes, he may have a hand like ace-king of spades he didn't 3-bet, or king-queen of spades, or king-jack of spades, etc. There are a decent amount of kings he can have. Maybe he plays hands like king-7 suited, etc. So there is a possibility he has hit this king. Even if he hasn't hit this king, it's not necessarily a good card in terms of extracting value, because if our opponent has a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 10s, he doesn't like this card because it's an overcard for his pair, and it also puts a potential flush out there. He's going to be less willing to pay off a river bet with a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 10s that he called on the turn with. However, given that in general we don't necessarily expect him to have a king, we don't necessarily expect him to have a backdoor flush that often either, he can have types of hand like 7-8 suited, as said, pocket 8s, pocket 10s, etc. Maybe 9-8 of spades, so he has second pair. There's definitely a chance that we can get paid off an additional street of value. The typical mistake that players make is they see this king of hearts in the river and they instantly check back because it's an overcard and there's a possible flush out there. Pocket queens might not be good anymore, it's definitely true. But in terms of our opponent's entire range, it's not that likely he's hit that river, and there are hands that can still pay off a small river bet. Again, in this case, we're going for thin value, we want to bet small. As is always the case when you're going for thin value, there's no point betting too big because you don't want your opponent to fold out the hands that you are trying to extract value from and only call with the hands that have hit on the river, for example the flushes and the king x's. Again, in this case, we bet reasonably small. I definitely think a smaller bet might work. You could even go so far as to bet 175 here, for example. So maybe even I like a slightly smaller bet again in this particular case. The main principle is that we still want to go for value, even though we could potentially perceive the river to be a scare card. Okay, moving on to our final leak of this video, Microstakes leak number 8, playing out of position. At the Microstakes, many players have no respect for position. They're only concerned with the two cards that they're holding, and in their mind, if they have ace queen, for example, that hand is pretty much just as good whether they are on the button or in the small blind, i.e. whether they are in position or out of position. Doesn't matter to them, they have ace queen, and that is the strength of their hand. If by any chance this is a new concept to you, we're going to consider why exactly is position important. What do we mean by position first of all? It's basically if you are the last to act in any given round. For example, perhaps you play a pot where the cutoff open raises and you call on the button. You're going to be in position in that hand post flop because in every round after the flop you are going to be the last to act. Why is this important? Firstly, you get to see what your opponent does before you. This means that you have more information compared to your opponent. So your opponent doesn't get to see what you do. He doesn't know anything about the strength of your hand aside from what he's seen on earlier streets, but you get that additional information about what your opponent does and you can make a more informed decision as a result. The second reason is you make the last bet on any given round. So if you are on the turn, for example, and your opponent checks to you, it's entirely up to you whether you decide to make a bet or you check back and both see a free river card. Basically, it's in your control whether there's additional betting that goes into the pot. This is very useful for doing things like pot controlling more effectively. You can keep control of the size of the pot if you are the one that basically controls whether additional money goes into the pot on each street. Whereas being out of position, it's a lot harder to do that, because if you check to your opponent hoping to keep the pot small, it's really down to your opponent whether he allows you to keep the pot small or he decides he wants to put in an additional bet. The second advantage being in position gives you is that it allows you to value bet more effectively. That additional information, by seeing what your opponent does before you on each street, allows you to assign him more accurately a range, work out which types of hands he's holding, and therefore you can be more effective with your value bets. Whereas out of position, the opposite is true. You have less information about your opponents. You may not be so sure that a particular bet you're making for value is going to be profitable. Finally, and this is a consequence of having more information on your opponent, it's also a result of being able to pot control more effectively, and that's that you can get away from the worst hand more often. So if your opponent has you dominated, it's harder for your opponent to extract value. Even if you don't completely get away from your dominated hand, you are going to lose a lot less money when you're in position, because it's harder for your opponent to extract value from you when he is out of position. Just to illustrate the importance of position and that it's such a big advantage, we'll have a look at this hand and notice in this hand how villain can use his position to put hero in a very difficult spot. In this case we have ace jack suited and we open raise from mid position and we get called by the button. This means that we are going to be out of position post flop. The flop comes jack 9-4, which is a good flop for us. We have top pair, top kicker, and we have a potential backdoor flush draw. We definitely want to fire a continuation bet here for value and to protect our hand against any overcards our opponent may have, etc. Our opponent calls. The turn is a 5 of diamonds, which is a good card for us. If we had the best hand on the flop, we probably still have the best hand now on the turn. If we were to give our opponent a range for calling the flop, we could perhaps say sometimes he may be floating with any two overcards. Most of the time he's going to have a hand like 10-8 or Queen 10 or any type of club draw. Sometimes a hand like King Jack, Queen Jack. Sometimes a combo draw like Queen King of clubs. We definitely want to fire again, therefore, on the turn to extract some more value from these draws and worse made hands. The turn comes a king, which is an interesting card. Firstly, it puts an overcard out there, so we only have second pair now. Also, it completes one of the possible straight draws, Queen 10. Can we fire again here for value? I would say in this case that the value here is probably going to be a little bit too thin. A hand like 8-10 is never calling, for example. Busted flush draws without a king are never calling. It's a lot harder now for our opponent to call with a hand like Jack Queen, now that there's a king out there. There's basically not enough hands we can get value from. Maybe once in a while we'd get looked up by Jack 10 or Jack Queen. But I wouldn't say this is necessarily a good spot to bet for value, coupled with the fact that our opponent can easily have a hand like Queen 10 or a hand like King Jack that he's improved on this river with. We decide therefore to check with the intention of deciding what to do when we see what our opponent does, and our opponent fires a reasonably sizable bet on the river, which puts us in a very tough spot. Because, as said, we don't expect players at the microstakes to bluff very often. So if our opponent has a hand like 10-8, he's possibly not going to be turning this into a bluff on the river, even though perhaps he should be in this situation. It's not necessarily the case that players never bluff with busted draws on the river. In fact, it is entirely possible he has a hand like 10-8. Just as a general trend, players, when they bet big, they are a lot more weighted towards strong-made hands than they are towards bluffs. In this case, our opponent's value range has us in really bad shape. We don't expect our opponent ever to be doing this with a hand like Queen Jack or 10 Jack. He's probably going to be checking back his medium strength hands. Perhaps he can even have a hand like 9-10 of diamonds. He's checking back these hands. Therefore, his betting range is polarized in that he either has a hand like 10-8 or a hand like Ace Queen of clubs, or he has a hand like 10 Queen, King Jack, Ace King of clubs, etc. Basically, we're put in this difficult spot not necessarily because we made a mistake in the hand, but simply because we are out of position. If you imagine this same hand, but instead of being out of position, we are in position on the river and our opponent checks to us, and we reach the same conclusion that we think it's a little bit thin to bet for value, then we can just check back the hand. It's not going to be a difficult decision, where as a result of being out of position, we're put to a complicated decision where, unless we know a decent amount about our opponent's value betting frequencies and bluffing frequencies, it's very difficult to make the correct decision. So this hopefully illustrates why being in position is very important. It makes your decisions easier, and the aforementioned things, easier to pot control, easier to value bet, easier to lose less when you have the worst hand. So what steps can we take in order to play less hands out of position and more hands in position? As we saw with that Ace-Jack suited hand, we didn't necessarily do anything wrong. We've got Ace-Jack suited from middle position. It's pretty much standard open raise. There's nothing we can really do about the fact that our opponent is going to call us in position on the button. So the first thing to acknowledge is you can't entirely cut out of position play completely from your game. You will have to play some pots out of position, but there's certain things you can do to limit the amount of hands you end up playing out of position. Firstly, you can tighten up your starting hands from early position. To give a very rough guide, the weakest hands you should be opening are perhaps King Queen offsuit from under the gun. You shouldn't be opening a hand like King Jack offsuit from under the gun, really. Perhaps you can get away with opening hands like Queen Jack suited, although they're somewhat borderline. In terms of aces, I'd say perhaps Ace Jack offsuit is the weakest hand you should be opening under the gun. Maybe you can get away with opening Ace 10, but Ace 9 is probably too weak. And suited aces, some players will open most suited aces from under the gun. I recommend, unless you want to get into difficult situations, that you fold most of your suited aces unless they are Ace 10 suited plus. And of course you can open most pocket pairs from under the gun. Some players like to fold pocket 2s through 6s in tougher games, but this is not a necessity. But overall, your range from under the gun should be tight. If you start opening hands like Queen Jack offsuit, Ace 8 offsuit, etc., you're going to run into some very tricky decisions, especially given that you're going to be out of position also. The same applies from the blinds. The blinds are going to be out of position post flop, especially the small blind, which is going to be out of position 100% of the time post flop. You want to tighten up your range of starting hands. As a very rough guide, again, you should avoid suited connectors, playing suited connectors out of position. Unless you're going to 3-bet bluff with them, you shouldn't really be flatting suited connectors out of position. In terms of high card hands, you should probably be folding hands that are weaker than about King Jack offsuit. Yes, it may be the case that if you have a hand like King 10 and the player on the button is opening very wide, yes, you may in fact be ahead of the button opener's range. However, it's going to be still difficult to play the hand profitably because you have to cope with the fact that you're going to be out of position in the hand. The times when your opponent does wake up with a king that dominates yours, like King Jack, King Queen, Ace King, you could potentially end up losing a lot more money as well, as a result of being out of position for the aforementioned reasons. Your opponent has more information on you, can value a bit more effectively. As a rough guide, you should be quite tight from the blinds, and you shouldn't really be flatting hands that are weaker than about King Jack offsuit. It really does depend on the button opener and how he's playing also, but this is just a very rough guide. Finally, don't flat 3-bets out of position. By doing this, you are falling into the category of both leak number 10, which is don't call too much, and leak number 8, which is don't play out of position. You're actually breaking both of these rules at the same time by flatting 3-bets out of position. Again, this is just a general rule, but it does apply in probably 95% of cases. You shouldn't be flatting 3-bets out of position. You should be folding, or you should be 4-betting. As we saw in leak number 10, it can be okay to fold hands as strong as pocket queens or ace king against certain opponents in certain situations. Specifically, we saw if we are an under the gun open raiser and we get 3-bet by one of the players in the blinds, there's a good chance that that player in the blinds who is 3-betting is a lot stronger than he might normally be when he's 3-betting. And it may be the case that our pocket queens or ace king is actually behind our opponent's range, and in such situations it doesn't necessarily matter the absolute strength of a hand. If we are behind our opponent's range, and in some cases we may be out of position also, we definitely don't want to continue with the hand. That brings us to the end of part 1 of this Microstakes Leak series. Just to recap, leak number 10, calling too much. Leak number 9, missing value. And leak number 8, playing out of position. So stay tuned for the next 2 parts of this video series where we will consider the remaining 7 Microstakes leaks. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.